What would you do if the person you trusted most laughed in your face and told you that you could never leave them? Tonight, we unravel a story of betrayal so cold and revenge so sharp it burned every lie to the ground. This isn't just about infidelity. It's about one man's quiet patience turning into explosive justice. And trust me, the way he serves his revenge will leave you speechless. Welcome back to Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoy these powerful stories of betrayal, karma, and survival, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's step into the storm and witness the story. She said I would never leave, so I served her and burned the lie to the ground. I once believed discipline was simply love disguised in work clothes. Every day began with precision: suit at 8, code by 9, stand up at 10. The ritual was my compass, the thing that kept my hands honest and my mind sharp. When Claire and I married, I thought she admired that about me, the way I could carve order out of chaos. She once said it made her feel safe, and for a while I think it did, until safety to her began to look like smallness. In the early years, our differences felt playful. After dinner, we would spar about management styles like boxers in soft gloves. I mocked bureaucracy as red tape while she praised it as structure. To me, middle managers were roadblocks, people who stole credit but delivered blame. To her, they were architects of flow, the quiet designers who kept the system moving. At first, it was a game that made us laugh. But games have rules, and when admiration turns into judgment, the rules change without warning. I remember the day clearly, a Tuesday, ordinary and quiet. I had just earned a raise and a rare thank you email from the company's owner. Claire smiled, but it wasn't the smile of pride. It was the brittle shine of politeness, like a plate under fluorescent light. "Imagine," she said softly, "what you could do with a graduate degree." I told her I'd rather keep building than borrow prestige at interest. She laughed, not cruelly, but in that way people laugh when they are filing away a note for later use. We had a good house, too big for two, but we told ourselves it was for the future, for the children we hadn't had, for the life we hadn't built yet. I turned one of the spare rooms into my workshop. Whiteboards crowded with diagrams, headphones dangling from hooks, prototypes scattered like puzzle pieces across the desk. It was messy, but it was alive. If love is seeing the same future together, then falling out of love is slowly sketching parallel ones. In mine, respect was the floor that held everything steady. In hers, respect had become a ceiling she wanted to break through, preferably with a framed credential hanging on the wall. It didn't begin with another man or with a message buzzing on a phone. It began with the erosion of language. She stopped asking me what I was building. I stopped asking who she wanted to become. We learned the geometry of avoidance, shaping our movements so we could live in the same space without ever colliding. The silence between us was not empty, it was pressurized. So when the day came that a device whispered a different truth than her lips, I didn't feel the ground opening beneath me. I only felt the confirmation of what had been trembling under my shoes for months. The fracture had always been there. All we had ever done was decorate it. The lockdown changed the rhythm of the world, but I tried to keep mine intact. While others treated home like a place to collapse, I behaved as though the office still existed. Shower, shave, collar and cuffs, even if the only elevator I walked into was the hallway between kitchen and desk. I closed my office door for the daily stand-up, not because I was hiding, but because focus had always been the only way I knew how to survive. Claire treated the house differently. To her, the walls became a lobby between distractions, sweatpants, 2 screens glowing at once, notifications hammering like hail on a tin roof. At first, I thought it was harmless, a quirk of quarantine, something we would laugh about later, but what starts as humor can calcify into accusation. One morning, toothbrush still in her hand, she asked, "Why the door?" I told her it was for quiet. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing, and replied, "From me." That was the trick, turn my concentration into secrecy. And once that seed was planted, every explanation I gave sounded like guilt rehearsed too many times. When her company announced half measures of reopening, she volunteered for the first wave. I recognized the hunger in her eyes. It wasn't about spreadsheets or culture. It was about an audience. Within days, evenings became performances staged in our living room mirror. A laugh a little too loud. Dresses with tags I hadn't seen on any credit alert. Perfume sprayed not for me, but for courage in some other world. She started using we for coworkers and you when she meant the problem standing across from her. I tried to hold on to our small rituals. Friday pasta, Sunday hikes, a book shared in fits and starts. She dismissed them with a wave. We see each other all day, she said, but it wasn't true. We passed each other all day. Seeing requires attention, and attention was the currency she no longer spent on me. Another Tuesday, always Tuesdays, she accused me of hiding. You close the door because you don't want me to know what you do. I wanted to tell her the truth. I closed the door because I wanted to keep us, because I thought boundaries might protect the last fragile thread between us. But words that once carried meaning now carried suspicion. And silence became heavier than any argument. There are distances you can measure in miles, and there are distances you can measure in inches. Ours was 7 feet, the width of a hallway, the length of a marriage thinning under fluorescent light. The door did not divide us. It only revealed the division we had been living with all along. When the office reopened, it wasn't the same building she had left. It was a stage reset after intermission. Cubicles were repainted as pods, rules renamed as culture. And in that new arrangement, Claire seemed to bloom, like an actress finally given her spotlight. Within the first week, she had gathered a trio of allies, 2 divorcees who wore their freedom like medals pinned to their chests, and a ringleader with sharp eyes that dissected rather than met. They handed her a new vocabulary, phrases that recast our marriage as a limitation rather than a foundation. You've outgrown him, the ringleader told her, as if a marriage could be measured like a pair of shoes. Through her stories, they learned me without ever meeting me. And then in their coffee-fueled dissections, they explained me back to her in ways colder and more cutting than I had ever imagined. My hands-on work was no longer craft, it was insecurity. My refusal of higher degrees became fear. My pragmatism was rebranded as fragile masculinity. They didn't just comment on me, they diagnosed me. And the diagnosis stuck because it fit the narrative they wanted her to believe. She came home different. At first it was subtle, a new turn of phrase, a certainty in her tone that didn't come from her own reflection but from their echoes. Certainty is dangerous when it outpaces truth, and in her, it grew faster than I could counter. Fridays brought drinks, first one then another. Soon even weeknights had their excuses, just this once, which quickly trained all the other nights how to behave. She began to glow with a light I no longer recognized, the kind of radiance that feeds on admiration. When she spoke of her boss, her voice tilted into a register that claimed respect but vibrated with something else entirely. I had seen that look before, admiration with a knife hidden underneath. I should have asked more sooner. But grief has a way of arriving before its reason, sinking the body before the mind can name the weight. The more she performed her new audience in front of me, the more I felt like a bad mirror, reflecting nothing back, unable to play along in a script that had already cast me as an obstacle. One night, the office blurred into an after-party. She sent a text that her phone battery had died, a lie so lazy it almost mocked me. I set the table for 2 anyway, placed plates side by side, and when she didn't come, I ate from both. Tradition mattered to me, even when the other chair was only holding her alibi. She returned home with laughter still clinging to her hair, a sound that didn't belong in our kitchen. Dropping her purse, she said, "Don't wait up next time." It wasn't cruelty, it was worse. It was the absence of fear. Every affair begins with an audience. Before there is a person, there is always a chorus, and hers had been rehearsing for weeks. She left it on the breakfast bar as if it were nothing, a silver rectangle smudged with fingerprints, faintly ringed by the outline of her coffee cup. "Can you wipe this for me? I'm giving it to my niece," she said, already halfway out the door. Perfume hung in the air like a flare announcing her absence. I said, "Sure." I always said sure to small requests that once carried intimacy but now only carried habit. When the door closed, the house returned to its quiet, not peace, but the kind of silence that hums with secrets. I plugged the iPad in and watched the battery icon bloom back to life. The lock screen opened with a passcode still stored in my muscles, a relic from when honesty lived between us. For a moment, the home screen looked innocent, almost nostalgic, apps like postcards from another time. But the messages icon pulsed red, not large enough to ignore, not small enough to be meaningless. I told myself I was only checking for sensitive files before a factory reset. That's how permission works. You grant it to yourself with words like stewardship, like responsibility. My thumb hovered, then pressed, and in an instant, the private life she thought she had hidden bloomed across the screen. The first photo was harmless if you didn't know faces, two people leaning too close at a bar that pretended to be a restaurant. Her smile, half mine, half stolen. Then the sentences, dressed as jokes, carrying the weight of plausible deniability. Then a video, an elevator mirror catching 4 hands where there should have been only 2. My body went still, a silence deeper than breath. The heart always knows when it has been replaced. I didn't stop. I copied everything. Years in software taught me to preserve before deleting, to document before erasing. Airplane mode first, no read receipts, no alarms sent to her lover. Message threads exported to PDF. Photos stored with metadata intact. Attachments sorted into folders named like my work projects, a disguise she would never question. Even screenshots of the thread list itself because the shape of a conversation can be as damning as its content. The calendar whispered another story in color blocks. Team dinners charged to accounts that didn't make sense. Mentorship check-ins scheduled at hours no mentorship should require. A reservation app confirming a table for 2 under an assistant's name. In the Notes app, I found the words that stung sharper than any image. A draft titled Pros and Cons of Staying. Under cons, he's become comfortable. I need to feel risk again. Under pros, my name followed by a single word, steady. My hands tightened around the tablet as though pressure alone could erase the betrayal written there. Worse than her boss were the friends. The group thread, the clique that had turned my life into a chorus line of mockery. They congratulated her for stepping into her power, sending screenshots of self-help quotes like scalpels. One of them even forwarded a confidential draft of her performance review, rewritten until criticism vanished and praise took its place. Their words weren't support. They were scaffolding for her betrayal. Then came the clip I can never unsee. Not explicit, far worse. Her boss's hand on the small of her back, ushering her into a conference room as if she were an heirloom being protected, not a colleague. The angle of the shot suggested someone else was filming, someone who wanted the record to live forever. My mouth tasted like rusted metal. Still, I kept copying. Hours passed unnoticed until sunlight shifted across the tile. I set the iPad down, breathing as though I had to remind my body how. Then, with methodical precision, I uploaded everything to my secure cloud, the one I used for code artifacts when I wanted versioning, plausible deniability, independence from prying eyes. Files nested, checksums verified, the progress bar crawling forward with cold indifference. When it was done, I didn't rehearse a confrontation. I didn't picture shouting matches or tears. Rage is loud, but rage is also expensive. I simply walked the perimeter of the house, touching familiar door frames, the picture rail where our wedding photo once hung, the couch where we pretended to still be us. The room was clean. The marriage was not. Finally, I did what she had asked. Settings. Erase all content. Confirm. Endings don't always arrive in flames. Sometimes they come as a sterile dialogue box asking if you are sure, and I was sure. I set the iPad back exactly where she had left it. Charger wrapped, screen spotless, as if cleansing the device could also cleanse the lie it had revealed. Then I sat at my desk, hands steady, and wrote to a lawyer I had never imagined needing. I didn't attach the evidence, not yet. There would be time for attachments later. His auto reply promised a call in the morning. I read it 3 times before closing the laptop. By the time headlights cut across the living room that night, my veins had already settled into a new climate. She hummed lightly as she keyed in, a tune that didn't belong to us. I didn't ask where she had been. She didn't notice the spotless tablet or the spotless counter or the distance between us that had finally found its own name. The lawyer didn't mirror my rage. He leaned back in his leather chair, glasses tapping lightly against his teeth, and said a single word I didn't want to hear. Wait. I had walked in with a hard drive full of files, with screenshots, receipts, and a voice steadier than my heart. He called it leverage. I called it poison I was forced to breathe. Yet as his words sank in, I knew he was right. Rage burns hot and quick. Courts reward the cold hand of patience. His advice was simple, brutal in its restraint. Build the record, make it undeniable, let time sharpen the blade. He recommended a private investigator, not the trenchcoat silhouette of pulp novels, but a retired cop named Ellis, a man with eyes that had cataloged too many lies, now earning a living in the quiet patterns of betrayal. His tools weren't fists, but lenses. His gift was noticing what people didn't bother to hide until someone asked the right question. I wired the retainer that night, my fingers heavy over the keyboard. Within days, Ellis began delivering his first findings. At a glance, the files looked like paperwork, bland and harmless. Dinner receipts coded as team development. Tabs at restaurants wherein trays started at $60, the same bottle of wine appearing over and over, her handwriting on the tip line. At first, she wasn't alone. 2 colleagues added like camouflage, but the repetition betrayed the truth. The camouflage wasn't for her, it was for me. Then came the performance reviews. Officially, she was praised as indispensable, but Ellis knew where to dig. The companies shared preserved draft versions even after edits. In the early drafts, words bled in red. Inconsistent deliverables, needs improvement in focus. By the final version, those wounds were washed clean, replaced by glowing lines of stability and excellence. The metadata told the real story. Her boss logged in at midnight, the same week their affair had ignited, erasing her failures and painting her in borrowed gold. Ellis called the Slack threads sanitized. What he meant was worse. Deleted messages left gaps like missing teeth. Timestamps with no replies, reactions to lines that no longer existed. And from backups, screens captured by someone else in the office. He stitched together fragments that revealed the truth. Inside jokes without setups. References to nights out that no longer had context. Erased but not invisible. Clean is suspicious. I read every file in a rented storage unit, the kind I told Claire was for my old computer parts. A fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, flickering in rhythm with my pulse as I turned each page, each receipt, each note. With every new document, my chest ached with a paradox I couldn't name. Proof was oxygen. Proof was also a knife. Still, the lawyer's voice echoed, "Wait, not yet. A hill isn't enough. You need a mountain. A story so intact, no cross-examination can shake it. Judges don't like drama, they like order." Patience became a new form of torture. Nights stretched long on the couch. Mornings blurred into routines performed by muscle memory, shaving for no audience, tying a tie for no meeting, coding features no one praised. My phone became a slot machine, and Ellis's updates the coins I couldn't stop feeding. Each report added weight to the scale. Each also carved deeper into me. But patience is not passive. It is a slow bleed that arms you. By the end of the 4th week, I held a dossier thicker than our wedding album. One record had captured the hope of vows. This one captured the truth of their demolition. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was architecture, each piece laid carefully so that when the time came, the structure would collapse under its own weight, and I would be ready to watch it fall. Patience had built me a fortress. Evidence stacked in my cloud, reports cataloged by Ellis, strategy whispered by my lawyer. I had turned my fury into cold preparation, into order, but all it took was one laugh to shatter that fortress and set fire to the walls. She came home late, careless, the way people act when they believe they are untouchable. Her heels clattered against the tile, her purse fell to the counter with practiced ease. She looked at me with eyes that didn't flinch, as though my presence was merely background noise. "You're still up?" she asked, but it wasn't curiosity. It was judgment, the kind of tone that reduced waiting into weakness. I looked at her and the words came sharp, stripped of hesitation. "I know." Her head tilted, lips curved. "Know what?" "That you've been sleeping with him." The silence should have been heavy, bending her shoulders, pressing guilt into the air, but instead she laughed, a full, confident laugh that filled the kitchen and hollowed my chest. It wasn't just a denial, it was mockery. "You," she managed between chuckles, "you think you're leaving me? Don't be ridiculous." My hand stayed flat against the table, my voice stayed even. "I've spoken with a lawyer." That broke her composure, but not into fear, into more laughter, crueler this time. She leaned back against the counter, eyes glittering with amusement. "A lawyer, please, you can't afford me. Even if you file, the court will give me half. You'll spend the rest of your life funding my new wardrobe while I live my best life, so don't bluff." Her words dripped arrogance, each sentence another dagger meant to pierce deeper. "This isn't a bluff," I said quietly. For the first time, her smile wavered, only slightly, like a flame bending in the wind. But then she steadied herself, cruelty returning in waves. "Oh, honey, this is the 21st century. A woman can have her cake and eat it too. You don't leave me. I leave you when I'm done. Until then you stay because you need me. That's how this works." Her smile showed teeth I no longer recognized. She wasn't mocking me out of anger. She believed every word as though they were scripture. I wanted to hurl the folder onto the counter, to bury her smugness under her own betrayal. The receipts, the texts, the metadata, all of it. But my lawyer's words pulsed in the back of my skull. Judges don't like drama, they like order. Timing mattered. Theater destroyed credibility, but fire doesn't ask for permission, and her laughter was gasoline. "You've mistaken endurance for weakness," I said slowly. "You've mistaken silence for surrender, and you've mistaken me for a man who will tolerate being mocked in his own home." She laughed again, softer this time, like pity. "You'll cool down, you always do." No, the cooling was over. Ice had carried me far enough, but her laughter lit the fuse patience could no longer smother. In my mind, I saw the cake, the photo, the words across white frosting, and for the first time in weeks I felt not just pain but clarity. Her voice receded into background noise. My pulse became the only sound I could hear. She believed she was untouchable. She believed the law was a leash she could tighten around my neck. She believed fear would keep me obedient. She was wrong. That night I didn't collapse onto the couch. I sat at my desk, bathed in the glow of my monitor, and drafted an email to my lawyer. I want the papers served, and I want it done my way. By the time dawn fractured the blinds, I was still awake, still burning, and I knew the exact words she would never laugh at again. "You've been served." Revenge doesn't always arrive with fire in its eyes. Sometimes it comes frosted in white, boxed in cardboard, carried by a man who whistles while delivering heartbreak. The night after Claire's laughter scorched my patience, I sat across from Ellis and my lawyer in an office that smelled of toner and stale carpet. The lawyer rubbed his forehead, shaking his head as I laid out my plan. "Absolutely not," he muttered. "Judges don't laugh at theatrics, they punish them. You pull a stunt like this, you could lose assets, maybe even alimony rulings." "I don't care," I said flatly. My voice carried none of the fury he expected, just clarity edged with steel. She laughed at me. She said I'd never leave. "This isn't just paperwork, it's a message." Ellis, sitting in the corner, smirked. He'd seen enough human cruelty to recognize when it took on new poetry. "He's serious," Ellis said. "And honestly, counselor, this might just work." The lawyer groaned, defeated by inevitability. "Fine. If you're going to nuke the bridge, I'll make sure the paperwork is airtight before you light the match." By morning, the plan was set in motion. A specialty bakery, a rush order, an obscene fee. The cake was enormous, commanding enough to own a conference room. Across the top, in thick, cheerful lettering, it read, "Here's your cake, eat it too." Above the words, laminated in edible ink, was the photo I had copied from her iPad, Claire wrapped around her boss in an embrace that banished all plausible deniability. The process server met me in the parking lot of her office. He was a man who had delivered 1,000 heartbreaks and still carried himself with the calm of a courier. He lifted the lid, took one look, and chuckled. "My friend, you're about to become a legend." I didn't follow him inside. That would have been indulgence. Instead, I sat in my car with the engine off, windows cracked, my pulse pounding like a verdict waiting to be read. Later, the accounts came back to me in pieces, through Ellis, through coworkers I barely knew, through Claire's mother's furious voicemail. The process server carried the cake straight to reception, asked for her by name. Claire arrived, radiant as ever, her orbiting clique trailing behind in perfume and giggles. She thought it was a delivery from a grateful subordinate, maybe even from her boss. Curiosity lifted her step. That's when the server set the cake on a nearby desk, lifted the lid, and slid the divorce papers across. His words landed like thunder. "You've been served." For a heartbeat, the room was silent, and then the gasps came, 8, 9 people at once. Faces twisted, eyes widened. And there it was, her own betrayal staring back at her from frosting, her own laughter immortalized in sugar and cream. Her reaction was volcanic. A shriek tore through the office, high-pitched enough to rattle glass. She swiped at the box, but the cake toppled onto the carpet and landed upright, like it had rehearsed its role, the words still legible, the photo still sharp, a monument of sugar to her downfall. The clique, the same women who had egged her on for months, turned instantly. Like wolves sensing weakness, they tore into her with moral outrage. They scolded, sneered, disowned. The same voices that once whispered rebellion now screamed condemnation. Her boss froze, pale as paper. Witnesses said he muttered something about professional boundaries before locking himself in his office, retreating behind an email barricade. Whatever fire they had shared, it was suddenly too hot for him to stand near. And Claire, she broke. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, sobs rattled her throat like shards of glass. The cake sat untouched, obscene in its cheerfulness, dividing the room into those who pitied her collapse and those who savored it. My phone buzzed endlessly that afternoon, her calls, her mother's curses, even a text from one of her co-workers. "You didn't just end her marriage, you ended her career." I didn't answer. I sat in the silence of my house, blinds half drawn, letting the quiet wrap around me like a cloak. For the first time since the iPad had lit up with truth, I felt heat instead of ice. Not joy, not peace, something rower. Vindication, sharp enough to cut. Revenge doesn't heal, but it cauterizes. The office spectacle should have been the end. Papers served, a cake rotting on carpet, a boss retreating behind closed doors. For most people, that collapse would have been enough. But shame never travels alone. It invites desperation, and desperation attracts predators. The predators were already close. The very clique that had fueled her arrogance, the same 3 women who had cheered her affair, whispered rebellion into her ear, and dressed betrayal as empowerment, turned on her within days. They circled her like vultures that had been waiting for the body to fall. The first message was almost polite. A text from the ringleader, 5,000, cash by Friday, or HR hears everything, followed by 2 smiling emojis, a grotesque attempt to dress extortion in cheer. Claire panicked. She hadn't been fired yet. HR had gone silent, pretending the scandal wasn't theirs to manage. Her boss, now operating strictly through email, was pretending she didn't exist at all. But the women knew more. They had screenshots of Slack banter, photos from nights out, and at least one video from a bar where Claire and her boss had been less careful than they believed. Ellis uncovered the twist that made the trap airtight. One of the women was sleeping with HR's junior gatekeeper, the man who filtered which complaints ever made it to the top. With him in her pocket, the clique could time their evidence for maximum destruction. Another woman, the quiet one with glasses, had ghostwritten Claire's glowing performance reviews for months. Every line of praise, every stabilizing force sentence had flowed from her keyboard, not her boss's. If she flipped, the record would show Claire as incompetent and complicit. The third, she needed no leverage of her own. Her loyalty to the ringleader was enough. And loyalty in such circles is more dangerous than proof. They didn't just want money, they wanted obedience. The text spelled it out. 5 now, more later if you want us to keep protecting you. Think of it as insurance. Claire's mother begged her to pay. A mutual friend told Ellis that Claire cried for hours, saying she was being punished for following her heart. But Ellis cut through the noise. "She's not a victim," he said, his voice hard with the experience of men who have seen too much. "She built her house on sand. Now the tide's coming in. Those women weren't allies, they were landlords waiting for rent." When Claire finally reached out to me, her pride was gone. No laughter, no taunts, just a stripped-down plea in my inbox. "They're blackmailing me. Please, you have to help." I stared at the email for a long time. My lawyer had warned me this moment would come. "She will collapse," he had said. "She will beg. Don't mistake collapse for change." He was right. Every word she wrote was still about herself, her job, her fear, her ruined reputation. Not once did she mention me. Not once did she apologize for the laughter that had ignited this fire. So I did nothing. Not yet. Because in her desperation, I saw a different kind of justice unfolding. The clique that had once poured gasoline on my marriage was now setting fire to her career. They had handed her the matches, and now they were charging her for the right not to burn. I had delivered my blow with a cake. Now her so-called friends would finish the job with a bill. The cake had been theater. The blackmail ring was chaos. But a courtroom doesn't care about frosting or whispers in hallways. It wants order dates, signatures, and facts lined up like soldiers. If I wanted to win, humiliation wasn't enough. I needed clarity so sharp it could cut through any excuse. We met in my lawyer's conference room, blinds half drawn, the air heavy with the smell of printer ink and old carpet. Ellis slid manila envelopes across the table with the calm precision of a surgeon preparing instruments. Every envelope carried weight, every timestamp its own kind of blade. The first order of business was money. My lawyer insisted I split our accounts before Claire drained them. I moved my half into an account under my name only. I closed joint credit cards. I froze the mortgage auto pay. Receipts stacked neatly in folders, deposits, transfers, balances. Numbers don't argue, they testify. Then came the recordings. Weeks earlier, when Claire had mocked me in our kitchen, when she had laughed at the mention of divorce, my phone had been in my pocket recording. Her voice, sharp with contempt, replayed in digital permanence. "You'll never leave me. Even if you did, I'd still get half." Another file caught her laughter, acidic, dismissive, when I told her I had spoken to a lawyer. Evidence doesn't need venom. It only needs tone. Judges hear arrogance more clearly than any jury. Ellis's PI reports formed the spine of the file. Photos of her entering restaurants under team dinner pretenses. Receipts with her handwriting covering the same entrees and the same bottle of wine night after night. Metadata from Slack threads. Deletions leaving behind gaps like missing teeth. Draft performance reviews preserved in server logs, where red ink had been replaced with gold stars once her boss logged in after midnight. Piece by piece, a timeline built itself like an autopsy. Month 1, the first dinner, the first altered review. Month 2, the affair begins, Slack threads sanitized. Month 3, the evidence compounds, her clique urging her forward. Month 4, the confrontation in our kitchen, her mocking laughter. Month 5, the cake, the service, her collapse at the office. Month 6, the blackmail, her so-called allies demanding rent. Each page stapled and dated, each thread cross-referenced with another. Chaos turned into sequence. My lawyer tapped the binder and said, "Courts don't like fog, they like calendars. And this is your weapon." I flipped through the thickening binder page after page and realized something unsettling. It didn't feel like revenge anymore, not the raw, burning satisfaction of watching her scream in front of her coworkers, not the savage thrill of a cake that humiliated her beyond repair. This was colder, cleaner, the work of demolition, not fire. "This is how you win," my lawyer said quietly. "You don't burn her, you let her bury herself. All you do is build the map." And he was right, for even in her collapse, Claire had written her own confession. Her emails begging me to intervene with her blackmailers. Her late-night apologies, framed not in regret but in desperation to protect her job. Her voice recordings where arrogance turned into pleading. Each artifact added texture to the file, not rage, not forgiveness, context. By the time we closed the binder, it was thicker than our wedding album. 2 records of a union, one beginning with vows, the other ending with evidence. When I carried it out under my arm, it didn't feel like a folder. It felt like a verdict waiting to be read. The cake had shaken the office like an earthquake. Her clique turned vicious, whispers crawled through hallways, and her boss, the man who had once been her refuge, locked himself behind silence and email. But silence is never empty. It's the sound of someone plotting. A week later, Ellis called me with that particular edge in his voice, the one that meant blood was in the water. "Your wife's boss is rewriting history," he said. "Corporate servers don't lie, not when someone knows where to look." Ellis's contact inside IT had leaked a treasure trove, draft memos buried in the company's system. HR statements half-written, paragraphs rehearsed like lifeboats, each one framed Claire not as his partner but as his pursuer. In his narrative, he was the victim of her ambition. He described unwanted late-night messages, inappropriate gestures at so-called team dinners. He painted himself as the patient executive, tolerating her advances to avoid embarrassing escalation. One draft even claimed, "I refrained from reporting earlier in hopes her attention would fade." On the surface, it was clever. To anyone without context, it fed into every stereotype HR departments cling to: protect the executive, isolate the subordinate. If this draft became official, Claire would look desperate, unstable, manipulative. But Ellis wasn't smiling when he handed me the USB. "Deeper," he said. The metadata betrayed him. Timestamps don't bend. Every document he claimed to have written months ago had actually been created within days of the scandal. The first contemporaneous note was drafted the same night Claire received her divorce papers. Another was edited at 2:13 a.m., just hours after the cake exploded across the office floor. His history wasn't history at all, it was construction built in panic. And there was more. Cached fragments of Slack messages, preserved by indexing servers even after deletion. In those fragments, the truth surfaced like bones through shallow soil. The late-night conversations hadn't been Claire chasing him. They had been his openings, "Still thinking about you." Last night was worth the risk. Claire's replies showed hesitation more than hunger. She wasn't innocent, but she wasn't the architect. He was. When my lawyer reviewed the evidence, he actually smiled, a thin, sharp expression that carried no humor. "This isn't just defense," he said. "This is controlled demolition." He thinks he's burying the fuse, but all he's done is prove it was lit the entire time. When it blows, the fire runs straight back to him. For days, I pictured the boardroom when those drafts surfaced. The boss, stiff in his chair, watching HR, realized the dates didn't align, the timelines collapsing in on themselves. Each contradiction a brick pulled out of his wall of lies. Claire had thought she was safe in his shadow. She didn't know he was already building the scaffold that would hold them both. I almost pitied her. Almost. But this wasn't about saving Claire anymore. This was about watching a man who thought he could rewrite reality get strangled by the very story he tried to invent. The counterfile grew heavier, sharper. And somewhere inside its weight, I understood this wasn't revenge anymore. It was inevitability. The boss thought his retroactive drafts would save him, but corporate systems are aquariums. Transparent, fragile, impossible to disguise once the first crack appears. And the crack didn't come from him. It came from outside. 2 weeks after the cake, a whistleblower hotline lit up. Not HR, not an internal manager eager to bury scandal, but an independent audit firm bound by contract to investigate every complaint. This time, no one inside could contain it. The system he thought he controlled had been bypassed. The audit team arrived without fanfare. No memos, no warnings. Just quiet footsteps, closed doors, requests for files that couldn't be ignored. Claire's clique panicked first. The women who had coached her betrayal, the same ones who had demanded blackmail money, turned on each other like cornered animals. Their scaffolding of gossip and manipulation was no match for forensic accountants and litigation lawyers. The auditors weren't looking for hearsay. They were looking for patterns, and patterns emerged fast. Cached Slack logs revealed their private strategy sessions. Screenshots surfaced, recovered from servers where fragments lived even after deletions. In black and white, the truth burned. Tell him he's not emotionally present. Men cave when you make it about feelings. Keep pushing the degree issue. Frame him as insecure. If he bites, we'll help spin it. You're owed more. Don't settle for being a paycheck. Marriage is leverage. Use it. They hadn't just been friends, they were handlers. Puppeteers pulling at Claire's strings, coaching her to destabilize her marriage and sell rebellion as empowerment. When confronted separately, the loyalty cracked. The ringleader blamed Claire, claiming she exaggerated everything. The quiet one insisted she was only role-playing. The third tried to paint herself as an innocent bystander, though her name appeared in dozens of messages egging Claire forward. The collapse was instant and vicious. Meanwhile, the auditors traced the boss's drafts. His so-called contemporaneous notes didn't survive metadata scrutiny. Timestamps betrayed him, every document created after the scandal, every lie recorded in digital ink. Worse, cached Slack fragments proved he was the initiator, not the prey. His words, "still thinking about you," last night was worth the risk. I shredded his entire defense. When HR received the interim report, their carefully polished glass floor shattered. For years, they had prided themselves on containment, on shielding leadership from scandal. But no amount of glass could withstand the weight of sunlight. The whistleblower hotline had forced transparency, and under that light, everything cracked wide open. For Claire, the revelation was brutal. The clique that once cheered her now clawed at her to save themselves. The boss she thought would protect her had already built his escape, framing her as the desperate one. And HR, her last shield, collapsed into self-preservation. She was exposed from every angle. From my distance, I watched it all unfold with something colder than satisfaction. It wasn't glee. It was inevitability. They weren't just falling, they were imploding. One lie at a time, one betrayal at a time, the whole rotten structure caved in. My lawyer summed it up best. "You don't need to push," he said. "Just keep your file clean. They're demolishing themselves." I leaned back, scrolling through the screenshots Ellis had forwarded me. Words once designed to manipulate me had become the rope tightening around their own throats. Claire once told me I'd never leave. Now, trapped beneath the collapse of her own allies, she was learning the truth. Saturday arrived with the gravity of a courtroom, though no judge presided. The kitchen table would serve as the bench, and the verdict had already been written in my mind. I refused to meet Claire alone. Those days were gone, days when whispered promises or unrecorded arguments could be twisted into weapons later. Two mutual friends sat with me, witnesses to whatever unfolded. Our phones, lined up on the table like silent jurors, glowed with red recording dots. She entered with hesitation in her step, carrying the weight of collapse in her posture. No smirk, no laughter, just a woman stripped of scaffolding, stripped of confidence borrowed from allies now turned predators. Her eyes darted between my friends, the phones, and me. She reached out awkwardly for a hug. I raised a hand instead. The gesture stopped her cold, as though she had collided with invisible glass. "I just want to talk," she said. Her voice trembled, trying to sound softer than it felt. "I know," I replied. My tone was calm, even flat. "That's why we're here. Go ahead." At first, her words spilled like a rehearsed script, apologies tangled with excuses. She said she had been swept up in bad influences, friends, office politics, a thrill that blurred into betrayal. She claimed she hadn't meant to destroy us, it had just happened. But when she reached for the word us, I cut in. There is no us. The words weren't shouted, they weren't bitter, they were plain like a weather report. Her face crumpled instantly, the collapse of a structure whose beams had already been eaten hollow. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "We've been together too long, we built this house, these memories, you can't just erase them." "I'm not erasing them," I said. "I'm recording them." I gestured at the glowing phones, all of it, the truth. That's the only thing left to protect. Her tone shifted, pleading now. She spoke of how thrilling it had been to step outside the lines, how quickly that thrill curdled into ash. She admitted the clique had turned on her, blackmailing her for silence. She confessed her boss had abandoned her, reducing all contact to sterile emails. She even admitted that the words she once laughed at, "You'll never leave me," haunted her like a curse she had spoken over herself. I listened, not with anger but with distance, and when she finally paused, searching my face for the man she once recognized, I gave her the only thing left. "Here's what you need to do," I said, my voice clipped, professional, as if dictating a report. "Self-report to HR, get your own lawyer, not mine, and find a therapist, because the way you swing from laughing in my face to crying for my help, that isn't love, it isn't regret, it's chaos, and it's not my job to fix it anymore." She reached across the table, fingertips brushing the wood as if that touch could close the distance. "I don't want strategy," she whispered. "I want you, I want us." I pushed my chair back slightly, not violently, just enough to widen the gap. "Then you want a ghost because that man is gone." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. My friend sat still, letting the truth echo. Claire lowered her eyes, shoulders folding inward as though she was finally seeing the ruins she had built around herself. Finally, I added the only line that mattered. "You asked about us. There is no us. There's only you, and whether you can live with yourself after the glass shatters completely." She wiped her cheeks, nodded once, small, brittle, broken. Then she left, footsteps echoing down the hallway, the front door clicking shut like the gavel of a judge. The kitchen, once filled with late-night laughter and arguments, now stood hollow. But for the first time in months, the hollowness wasn't suffocating. It was clean. Court doesn't roar when you enter. It hums, sterile and relentless, like an air vent too loud to ignore. The fluorescent lights bleach everyone into the same pale shade, the bailiff's voice flattening drama into procedure. But to me, every cough, every shuffle of paper, every scrape of chair legs sounded like thunderheads building above us. The first storm cloud came quickly, the cake. Claire's lawyer wasted no time. He rose with theatrical solemnity, declaring that divorce was not theater, that serving papers with a frosted photo of betrayal was juvenile, prejudicial, unbecoming of a man who claimed seriousness. He painted me as a hothead addicted to spectacle. The judge frowned, a long, deliberate frown that seemed to stretch a whole season across his face. "This court," he said, "does not encourage stunts. Humor has no place in dissolution proceedings." His gavel didn't fall, but the air grew colder. For a moment, I thought I had slit my own throat with buttercream. But weather shifts when truth is heavier than theatrics. My lawyer stood, calm and unhurried, and opened the counterfile we had built. Photos slid onto the bench, screenshots, Slack logs, receipts, performance reviews preserved with metadata that exposed midnight edits. He spoke in order, not in outrage, turning chaos into chronology. Every page cracked open another sky. And then the rain came, the blackmail ring. My lawyer didn't sensationalize it. He didn't need to. He simply laid out that Claire's so-called mentors weren't guiding her, they were extorting her. One sleeping with HR's gatekeeper, another ghostwriting her performance reviews, all three demanding hush money. It wasn't a marriage problem anymore. It was systemic rot bleeding out into her career. Claire's lawyer flailed, objecting that it was irrelevant to the dissolution. "A distraction at best," he insisted. But the judge shook his head slowly. "A spouse's entanglement with workplace misconduct speaks to character, to credibility, to financial liability. It weighs." I watched Claire from across the aisle. She had dressed in muted tones, a gray blazer, her hair tied back tight as if invisibility could shield her. But invisibility was impossible when her choices were projected in black and white across the courtroom. Her eyes darted like a cornered animal searching for an exit that didn't exist. The judge turned back to me. "The cake," he repeated, softer now, "was ill-considered." But he paused, letting silence stretch until the air itself seemed to lean forward. "Fault is clear. Evidence is abundant. Whether favors the party who comes prepared." Relief didn't wash over me. It trickled, cautious, like the first sunlight after storm clouds shift. This wasn't victory yet. It was leverage. The storm was breaking in my favor, and that was enough. The proceedings shifted. Negotiations opened like a door on rusted hinges. Claire's team knew they couldn't fight on the merits. To drag this through trial would mean bleeding reputation, assets, dignity. Already whispers from her company circled in the courthouse halls, an ethics audit, a collapsing narrative, her boss exposed as the architect of his own lies. My lawyer leaned close and whispered, "This is the turning point. They'll settle. They have to." For the first time in months, I felt something close to calm, not joy, not triumph, just the clean, sharp air after a storm, the sense that the sky might finally hold. When Claire's lawyer asked for a recess to discuss settlement terms, the judge granted it with a tap of his gavel. Claire rose, shoulders sagging, eyes refusing to meet mine. She looked not like a victor, not even like a fighter, but like someone drenched in whether she thought she could control. I stood too, binder still in my hands, remembering the judge's frown, but also his final words. The cake might have drawn thunder, but truth had delivered lightning. And lightning always strikes where it's meant to. The storm of the courtroom broke into drizzle the moment the gavel tapped for recess. No more thunder, no lightning, just the low hum of fluorescent lights above a long oak table where both legal teams now sat. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a negotiation trench. Her lawyer's voice carried the residue of defeat, measured but heavy. "We are prepared to consider settlement. My client acknowledges complications." The word complications hung in the air, a fragile euphemism for affairs, blackmail, falsified reviews, and the humiliation that had already scorched her career. He didn't say fault, but everyone at the table could taste it. My lawyer said nothing at first. He simply slid the counterfile closer to the center, its presence enough to tilt the room. "The record speaks for itself," he said finally. "We're not here to humiliate, we're here to resolve." Claire sat across from me, her blouse wilted from the heat of the courtroom, strands of hair clinging to her temples. This was not the woman who once leaned across the kitchen counter and laughed at the word divorce. This was someone stripped of scaffolding, sitting in the ruins of a performance that had collapsed on its own weight. The terms began to take shape. She would resign from her position. Her lawyer had already drafted the letter, phrased as cooperation with an ongoing audit, but we all knew it was exile disguised as dignity. The promotion she had angled for, the reputation she had polished through manipulation, evaporated in a few strokes of pen. Titles mean nothing when the foundation beneath them is sand. She broke her silence once. "The house," she said, her voice cracking in the quiet. "It was supposed to be ours." My lawyer answered before I did, his tone cool, clinical. "The mortgage is secured by his income, his planning. She is welcome to seek alternate housing." Claire flinched. For a heartbeat, the fire I once knew flickered in her eyes, the old arrogance trying to rise, but it died as quickly as it came. She sagged into her chair, exhaling like someone who had been holding her breath for months. It wasn't about revenge anymore, not here, not at this table. The truth had already burned hotter than anything I could do. I didn't want to salt the earth. I wanted my home, my stability, my silence. I wanted air after years of fire. Her lawyer made a half-hearted attempt at spousal support, citing contributions to the marriage. My lawyer didn't blink. Contributions that coincided with extramarital affairs, blackmail conspiracies, and reputational damage. We'll let the judge weigh that. The push collapsed without resistance. In the end, the agreement was clear. I kept the house. The accounts were divided, but my half had already been secured. She walked away with her car, her personal accounts, and the residue of her own choices. No alimony, no support. Just papers to sign, a resignation letter, and a future stripped bare. We signed with pens that felt heavier than swords. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was aftermath. The smell of smoke after a fire, lingering, unavoidable. When we stood, Claire finally looked at me. Her eyes were rimmed red, but her voice was steady. "You really did leave." I didn't answer. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. On the courthouse steps, sunlight spilled across the stone. My lawyer clapped me on the shoulder. "You got what you came for," he said. I nodded, but deep inside I knew it was more than that. I hadn't just burned her lie to the ground. I had chosen not to burn myself with it. The terms of exit were written in ink. The terms of self, I would write those on my own. The paperwork was filed, the signatures dried. The house was mine, the marriage was not. It didn't feel like triumph, it felt like vacuum. For weeks, I had lived in fire, betrayal, evidence, strategy, courtroom storms, and then suddenly only silence. The kind of silence that doesn't roar but lingers like smoke after a blaze. At first, I moved through the house like a ghost haunting my own life. The dining table still bore faint rings from her wine glasses. The couch cushions still sagged with the imprint of evenings we had once mistaken for happiness. Some nights, I stood in the spare room, the one I had turned into a lab of fragments, and stared at the whiteboard, the maps of problems I used to chase. The problems on that wall were solvable. The one that had burned my marriage was not. I thought about selling the house just to breathe air not poisoned by memory. But my lawyer's words lingered. You fought to keep it, make it yours. So I began small. I repainted the office where I had found her secrets. The beige walls became a deep blue, steady as the ocean, a color that belonged only to me. I replaced the desk clutter with shelves of books I had promised myself to read but never had time for. Each stroke of paint, each small change was not erasure. It was reclamation. Routines followed. Morning coffee on the porch instead of at the desk. Evening jogs that stretched further each week, until my lungs burned for reasons that felt clean. Therapy sessions that began with anger but slowly shifted into questions of identity. Who was I outside betrayal, outside revenge? Friends returned too, people I had kept at arm's length while drowning in code and chaos and the slow poison of a failing marriage. They invited me to trivia nights, to hikes, to spaces where laughter wasn't a weapon but a release. For the first time in years, I said yes, not to fill silence, but to let it breathe. Of course, her shadow lingered, a stray email about utilities, a mutual friend's update that she had moved back in with her mother, that she was figuring things out. I didn't follow. That story wasn't mine anymore. The final twist was quiet, almost anticlimactic. It came one morning, coffee steaming in my hands as the sun fractured the sky into streaks of amber. I realized I wasn't thinking about her. Not the iPad, not the cake, not the courtroom, just the warmth of the mug, just the day ahead. Winning had once been the goal, proving her wrong, burning the lie to the ground. But the life that rose from the ashes wasn't about winning. It was about not needing to. I no longer needed to prove I could leave. I already had. I no longer needed to prove I could survive without her. I was surviving. I no longer needed revenge to define me. I had oxygen instead. Now, when people ask about the divorce, I don't tell them about the cake, or the blackmail, or the courtroom weather that cracked wide open. I just say it ended. I rebuilt. I breathe easier now because the story isn't hers anymore. It's mine. And mine doesn't begin in fire. It begins in air. And so the story of she said I would never leave, so I served her and burned the lie to the ground comes to an end. In the ashes of betrayal, he found not just revenge, but freedom. The kind of freedom that breathes new life after destruction. What about you? If someone laughed at your pain and believed you could never walk away, what would you do? Share your thoughts below because your voice makes this community stronger. And don't forget, subscribe to Cheating Stories 7. Leave a like and join us in the next story filled with drama, betrayal, and justice. Until then, remember, betrayal always has a price, and sometimes revenge writes the final chapter.